Focuses on the topic of conservative coalitions.
Welcome to the final general session of the first day of the National Review Institute Summit. My name is William Rusher, and I'll be your moderator. We are going to proceed now because I explained earlier we have obligations to C-SPAN which keep us on schedule whether we like it very much or not. I think it is appropriate, given what others have done, for the moderator to say a few words to sort of set the stage, but I'll make them very few. Our topic, as you know, is Traditionalists, Libertarians, and Economists, a new alliance against the radical state, ? So the question of the alliance is up for grabs here, along, I'm sure, with much else. It's an interesting trio, Traditionalists, Libertarians, and Economists. I know pretty much what I think a traditionalist or a libertarian is, and of course you know the definition of an economist. That's somebody who doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. So, whether this will make a good alliance remains to be seen. I have only one thought in regard to the question of the alliance that I would like to leave with you. The conservative movement was never monolithic. It began as a coalition, and it wasn't even called conservative. I was interested to discover a few years ago that Bill Buckley didn't even call the thing conservative in God and Man at Yale. He talked about the individualists versus the collectivists. He talked about the Christian tradition at Yale. You knew implicitly from references that he was anti-communist, but conservatism as the word for our movement was developed, I think, by Russell Kirk, probably with his book, The Conservative Mind. But as I said, it was not a monolithic movement. It had in it at that time traditionalist and libertarian and rather more simply just anti-communist elements. And these have continued in it ever since. And there have been, of course, some remarkably influential additions. The neoconservatives came along in the mid-1960s. The New Right, so-called, by Kevin Phillips in the early 1970s. The religious right in the late 1970s. And rather surprisingly, given the name that they adopted for themselves, the Paleo-Libertarians and Paleo-Conservatives in the early 1980s. But here we all are, more or less still together, and I hope we remain that way, because let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, if this movement ever starts preferring to fight among itself rather than with the enemy, they'll pluck us apart in no time at all. With those few thoughts, I turn to the greater pleasure of introducing our speakers. We're going to work in what I might call geographical order, beginning there and working this way. So our first speaker will be Llewellyn H. Rockwell, Jr., who, prior to his present work, was Chief of Staff to Congressman Ron Paul, among other things, first editor of Hillsdale College's widely distributed Imprimis, and a senior editor of Arlington House and the Conservative Book Club, and holds the George Washington Honor Medal for Leadership in Economic Education from the Freedoms Foundation in Valley Forge. He is best known today, of course, for his present position as president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the free market economics of the so-called Austrian school. And the institute is affiliated with Auburn University in Alabama and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I give you as our first speaker then, Llewellyn H. Rockwell, Jr.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here at another O'Sullivan extravaganza and with such eminent colleagues and with such an eminent chairman of our panel. In the post-war period, deep differences divided traditionalists, libertarians, and economists. It, as the title of our panel indicates, if there was ever a time for uniting the right, this is it. We face the Clintonian state, and battling it requires a new coalition focused not on Bosnia or Russia, but on what's good for America, for American prosperity, for American families, for American communities, for American liberty, for the American future. Traditionalist libertarians and free enterprisers agree that our at least secular enemy is the central state, which destroys our prosperity, ravages our traditions, wrecks our families, savages our communities, loots our property, and subverts our liberty. But such an alliance as suggested by our title is not unprecedented. At least 3 times in American history, a coalition united on the principles of liberty and property did heroic work. First, consider the New Deal. Our side swung into action against Franklin D. Roosevelt very early on. That man in the White House shredded economic liberty, constitutional government, and federalism. His first 100 days were a virtual coup d'etat against the Republic of the Founders. The old right went to war against his subversion of the rule of law, his repudiation of the free market, his abandonment of sound money, his leaf-raking national service, his Mussolini-like National Recovery Act, his scheme to pack the court, and his underhanded campaign to involve us in European intrigues. As Garrett Garrett wrote, Roosevelt, like Octavian before him, brought about a revolution within the form, pretending to preserve the republic while devouring it from within. The old right was an extremely diverse lot, but they all cheered when libertarian H.L. Mencken compared FDR, our real presidential dirty trickster, to a glorified barroom bouncer, always ready to gouge when the inspiration came to him, or to bite in the clinches, or to use chair legs, cuspidors, and ice picks. The economists of the old right also battled the Rooseveltian state. Henry Hazlitt held a prestigious post as literary editor at The Nation, but he didn't hesitate to attack Roosevelt's inflationary bank policies, the totalitarianism of his gold confiscation and price controls, and the insanity of his agricultural program, modeled as it was on the Soviet system. Hazlitt was fired, but he went on to become a senior editor at a much more important publication, the National Review. Traditionalists joined the fight as well. Northerner Albert J. Nock loved individual liberty, but he also opposed FDR's Leviathan as culturally vulgar and a threat to community life. The anti-New Deal coalition included Southern traditionalists, especially the contributors to the volume, I'll Take My Stand. The editor of that work was Donald Davidson, who wrote the magnificent anti-Roosevelt Attack on Leviathan. Davidson's colleague, Andrew Lytle, was also a fierce opponent of FDR's public works projects, especially the Tennessee Valley Authority, which combined socialism and Soviet-style agitprop to destroy some of the best farmland and some of the best farm families in our country while enriching the special interests. The Southern agrarians called themselves anti-modernists, but they happily united with modernist libertarians like Isabel Patterson and Rose Wilder Lane, pro-business journalists like Garrett Garrett, and even ex-progressives like John T. Flynn. How was this possible? Because they all opposed the New Deal's leap into what Jefferson called consolidated government and the redistribution of property that came with it. The coalition disagreed on many matters, but they had better things to do than to try to excommunicate each other. Every pen and every voice was essential to the cause. For the second example, we can look to the 19th century when the economy was largely free. Then government allowed the people the freedom to buy and sell their wares as they wanted, while strict protection of private property made possible the flourishing of communities so beautifully documented by Tocqueville. But from the early part of the century, there was one glaring exception to economic freedom, the Northern Tariff, designed to protect Northern industry against European competition. The Northern tendency towards isolationism and protectionism had terrible consequences for the economy and culture of the South. Southerners wanted free trade with the world for economic reasons and on the principles of free government. They did not want their property rights and states' rights subjugated by a powerful central state. As the tariff taxed away their earnings, hampered the sale of their products, squeezed their communities and families, the South began to fear for its survival. All we want, said Southern Republicans like John C. Calhoun, is free trade and moderate taxes, frugality in the government, accountability, and a rigid application of the public money to the payment of the national debt. Although a traditionalist, Calhoun was in union with libertarians like John Randolph of Roanoke and Lysander Spooner, both of whom favored states' rights over consolidation. Much later libertarians like Frank Chodoroff also wrote on the importance of states' rights and condemn the anti-South bigotry that characterized Reconstruction and the period since as both unjust and as an ally of statism. The Northern Libertarian Felix Morley, an early editor of Human Events, described the political horrors of the Civil War for the North. Lincoln established military tribunals to try dissidents in areas where civil courts were in operation, arrested people for speech crimes, suspended habeas corpus, drafted Americans into an aggressive war, inflated the currency, passed the first income tax, and established the big business, big government partnership that we've all come to know and love. Looking back even further into American history, we can find another coalition of free enterprisers, traditionalists, and radical anti-statists. These were the men who united to oppose unrestrained executive power during the debates on the Constitution. The so-called anti-federalists were from the North and the South, although the most eloquent were Virginians Patrick Henry and George Mason. From the Articles of Confederation, the proposed new Union represented a large increase in power. If we are to have the Constitution, these men insisted, the central state must be restrained by a Bill of Rights, especially a 10th Amendment to protect the rights of the states and of the people. Otherwise, said George Mason, the Congress may grant monopolies in trade and commerce, constitute new crimes, inflict unusual and severe punishments, and extend their powers so that the state legislatures have no security for the powers now presumed to remain to them or the people for their rights. There is no declaration of any kind, he said, for preserving the liberty of the press or the trial by jury in civil cases, nor against the danger of standing armies in times of peace. Because of these men, we got a Bill of Rights, and it did restrain the central government at least until the doctrine of incorporation. From then on, as Patrick Henry had predicted, the enemy of American liberty was to be found not overseas, but in Washington, D.C. The anti-federalists saw what others did not and sounded the alarm. So did the Southern Republicans, so did the anti-New Dealers. Each of these groups, built on diversity in particulars but agreement on broad principles, opposed consolidated government. But weren't they all on the losing side? Yes, they had the courage to stick to principle regardless of cost. They knew that the history books might condemn them, yet they looked beyond history and saw that one day they would face a higher judge than popular or academic opinion. It is on the shoulders of these great men that we stand, even if we rarely acknowledge it, and these same men point the way to a coalition for liberty today. We face an ominous threat. If Hamilton wanted a too-strong executive, Clinton wants total obedience. If Lincoln suspended legal protections, Ira Magaziner has open contempt for the rule of law itself. If the New Deal meant the passage of the Social Security Ponzi scheme, Hillary wants to make insurance fraud official government policy with costs that could eventually dwarf World War II's. That is why we need unity, but with tolerance for diversity within that unity as we fight the consolidated government of the egalitarian welfare state. We may not win. Future generations may not even thank us for having fought, but we will have done what we know to be right. As Patrick Henry said, we are descended from a people whose government was founded on liberty. Our country is great, not because our government is strong and energetic, but because liberty is its direct end and foundation. Nothing can be more important than fighting to preserve and enlarge that foundation, as our predecessors did in 1776, 1787, 1860, and 1932. Surely we can all agree on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Carla Keene Bowman was graduated from the University of Wisconsin, and among other things was in 1985 a fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics. She has written very extensively, but her career has been spent mostly at the American Enterprise Institute, which she joined in 1979 and of which she was made a resident fellow in 1983. From 1981 to 89, she was the managing editor of AEI's Public Opinion magazine, and she is today the editor of the American Enterprise, the flagship publication of the Institute. I give you Carolyn Keene Bowman.
Thank you very much, and let me take a very different perspective from Llewellyn's this afternoon to address our topic. An alliance of traditionalists, libertarians, and economists against the radical state will likely fail for the very simple reason that most Americans do not see the state as radical. A new alliance based on that assumption cannot win broad-based political support today. Americans have always been profoundly ambivalent about the state, but they do not see it as radical, if by radical John means the boogeyman of big government. At one and the same time, Americans see government, including the federal government, as a problem solver and a problem causer. On the one hand, they believe that because ours is a rich and powerful democracy, that government, and particularly the federal government, should do many things. On the other hand, they see big government as intrusive, powerful, too powerful, inefficient, and ineffective. The weight of the evidence today, Bill Clinton's election notwithstanding, is on the latter view of government as a problem-causing institution. When Americans were asked on Election Day whether they wanted a bigger government with more services and higher taxes, or whether they wanted a smaller government with fewer services and lower taxes, only Clinton's voters, only Clinton's supporters opted for a bigger government. Perot and Bush supporters voted decisively in the exit poll for a smaller government. But Americans, as I suggested, do not see the state as radical or subversive or as Big Brother. When asked in 1938, for example, whether or not the government should be responsible for providing medical care for people unable to pay, 81% of Americans agreed that it should. When Gallup repeated that question 50 years later, in 1991, the response was the same. When Time Yankelovich asked Americans last week whether or not the federal government should guarantee health insurance for all Americans, 63% of Americans said that government should. This does not mean that Americans endorse the Clinton health care plan or that universal coverage is something that they insist on today. But it does mean that Americans see a considerable role for the state in the provision of health care. In an ABC News Washington Post poll released this week to look at just two other areas where Americans see a considerable role for government, 8 in 10 Americans told the pollsters that the federal government can do much to make the economy better and also to reduce crime. While we see a substantial role for government in our society, survey evidence today reveals widespread dissatisfaction with the governmental enterprise. Nearly 6 in 10 Americans say that they feel mad as hell about the way things in the country are going these days. 8 in 10 do not trust the government in Washington to do what is right. Only about 3 in 10 approve of the job that Congress is doing. 7 in 10 told the pollsters 2 weeks ago that government causes more problems than it solves. So groups can be mobilized around dissatisfaction, and they have a great chance of being successful politically. That said, I think it's useful to think about new alliances that might be deployed against a wasteful, inefficient, and ineffective big government. The level of popular discontent in the country today suggests to me that many Americans of different stripes could be radicalized against an expensive, overly intrusive government. The alliance will probably look different from the current political ones. The party labels have lost much of their meaning, and many Americans do not perceive much difference in the way that Bill Clinton or Newt Gingrich, for example, would handle the crime problem. Ideological labels may have more resonance, but we know, too, that they can mislead us. 89% of self-identified conservatives with less than a high school education tell the pollsters that homosexual activity is always or almost always wrong, while far fewer, about 66%, of self-identified conservatives with a college education feel that way. In other words, the self-identified conservative with a college education looks pretty much like a liberal on that question. The demise of the parties has led some observers to try to identify new coalitions that might better capture people's thinking and indicate where new alliances could form. Stuart Lilly and Robert Maddox wrote a book for Cato a number of years ago that they called Beyond Liberal and Conservative, suggesting what some of those new alliances might be. Several of the pollsters have picked up on the idea of Maddox and Lilly, and they've tried to go beyond those two labels. I thought I would share with you today some of the results of the polling Gallup has done for several years, and most recently just this month, trying to do just that. Gallup asks 2 very straightforward questions and then segments the electorate into 4 different groups: liberals, populists, libertarians, and conservatives. Think about how you would answer these two questions. Here's the first. Some people think the government is trying to do too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses. Others think that government should do more to solve our country's problems. Which comes closer to your view? In January, 54% of Americans said that government was doing too much, but 39% said that government should be doing more to solve the country's problems. The second question goes like this. Some people think the government should promote traditional values in our society. Others think the federal government should not favor any particular set of values. Which comes closer to your view? In January, a little more than half of us said that the government should promote traditional values, but 40% said that the government should not favor any particular set of values. If you said, in response to that question, that government was doing too much, and also that government should promote traditional values, Gallup classified you as a conservative. 30% of Americans fell into that group. If you said that the government was doing too much and that government should not promote any particular set of values, you were classified as a libertarian. 22% of the population fell into that category. Populists, by Gallup's definition, wanted government to play a larger role in the society and to promote traditional values. And Gallup found 20% of these people in the population. Liberals, the smallest group by this definition, wanted government to do more, but not to promote a particular set of values. To recap, using this typology, Gallup finds 30% of Americans would be called conservatives, 22% libertarians, 20% populist, and 16% liberals. Gallup used the typology 3 times last year and found that in 2 of the 3 tests, conservatives were the dominant group. They were the largest group again this January. By this Gallup definition, libertarians and conservatives together would easily constitute a majority of the electorate. But I think we need to look beyond that overview to see how dissimilar and similar the views of conservatives and libertarians are in the Gallup polling data, particularly using this new typology. I didn't have the time, unfortunately, to do a lot of test runs on particular questions, but I decided to look at the views of conservatives and libertarians on Bill Clinton, using the standard polling question, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Bill Clinton is doing as president? Not surprising, I'm sure, to many of you, only 36% of conservatives, perhaps that's high, approved of the job that Bill Clinton is doing as president. But what was striking to me was that 55% of libertarians approved of the job that Bill Clinton was doing. I decided that result seemed odd, went back to test the results in the earlier Gallup polls using the same typology, and in fact, that's what it showed in each asking, with libertarians far more disposed toward the Clinton presidency than conservatives. Not surprisingly, both populists and traditionalists in this particular category gave Clinton very high marks overall. If traditionalists and libertarians cannot agree on this president, is there much hope of a permanent alliance in the future? I think Bill Rusher is clearly correct when he says that the conservative movement has never been monolithic, and Llewellyn Rockwell is, I think, right on target when he suggests that alliances are not unprecedented and they can be revived again. But I think that an alliance can be revived only if we recognize that Americans see a limited, albeit a central role for the government in many areas of American life. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Our next speaker, Dr. Michael Novak, has achieved prominence in several fields. Currently, he is the George Frederick Jewett Chair in Religion and Public Policy at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington, where he also serves as Director of Social and Political Studies. In 1992, Margaret Thatcher presented him with the annual Anthony Fisher Prize for the Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, his latest book. He has recently become editor-in-chief of the monthly journal Crisis. In various of his epiphanies, he has served as an ambassador, heading at one point the U.S. delegation to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the monitor of the Helsinki Accords, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the m and holding a seat on the board for International Broadcasting, the private corporation that governs Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. In academic terms, he had accepted in the past a tenured chair as university professor and distinguished professor of religion at Syracuse University, and held the Welch Chair as Professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. This grows naturally out of his training as a theologian. He graduated summa cum laude from Stonehill College and the Gregorian University in Rome cum laude in 1958 and continued his theological studies thereafter. So, we call next upon the multi-talented Dr. Michael Novak.
Thank you, Bill. Your introduction reminded me that when I was studying the history and philosophy of religion at Harvard, was the time I met and proposed to and was lucky enough to marry my wife, Karen. Her father in those days began to refer to me as his son-in-law, the celestial physicist. And he made a point of telling me at least twice a year, Michael, if you can't do it, teach it. So my remarks to you are going to be a little different from those who are closer to the practical work and the essential work of politics. I'm going to ask you to go down a little deeper in search for the unity that unites us as Americans, and unites us in a special way as conservatives, with all the variety of conservatives that we represent. Let me begin with an old phrase. I want a Trinitarian to the bitter end to make 3 points, and let me begin with an old phrase. Cult is the center of culture. Not all conservatives are religious, but all conservatives do recognize that crucial ideas and principles, habits and practices of our republic and of the conservative movement grow out of religious soil. The first point under that heading I want to make is that Jews and Christians, Judaism and Christianity, are distinguished among religions as being religions of remembrance. There is an essential conservative aspect to being Jewish and to being Christian. Our central liturgies, such as the Seder, or the Eucharist, or the reading of the Word, are all exercises in remembrance. Even outside of religion, conservatives are people, someone has said, a wit has said, who tend to think that their grandparents were at least as wise and as admirable and as brave as they are, and want to carry forward something from the past, to be worthy of the past. Second point I want to make is that Judaism and Christianity are also distinguished among the religions by being religions of expectation, religions of the future. In fact, scholars who investigate the roots of the idea of progress in Western culture have been obliged to point out that those roots lie in the expectation of the Messiah, the notion that history is not an endless cycle of returns. It is going somewhere. It is leading somewhere. And therefore, the very roots of the notion of progress come out of a Jewish and Christian idea. And so those first liberals that Gene Kirkpatrick and Irving Kristol and others were talking about at lunch thought that they were here founding a republic of enormous importance for the future, a model never before seen, to which nonetheless all parts of the globe would one day repair, as Washington put it in his farewell address. And so it has happened. On a bitter cold day in November of 1989, in Prague, just off Wenceslav Square, a young man working in a brewery stood up in a box trying to persuade his fellow workers to come out and join the students in Wenceslav Square in the beginnings of the Velvet Revolution. And he took the box and he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." And he went on to repeat even more. It's hard for us to get used to, having grown accustomed for so many years to being thought of as ugly Americans, to be present in St. Petersburg, as I was lucky to be on the very first day it was St. Petersburg again. The first day the flag of Russia replaced the red flag over the public buildings, and to be told by a Russian philosopher and a poet together how good they felt to be a normal people again, like you, and described their standing in the square outside of the Winter Palace just a few days before, resisting the tanks that were sent out to crush. This is 1991, set out to crush the movement to protect the Constitution. And they went out 400,000 strong and stood in silence, not knowing whether their pictures would be taken, their careers would be ended, not knowing whether the tanks would open fire. And they stood in unbroken ranks. And they felt so good about that. And again, he said, now we have a history like yours. Now, the third point I want to make has to do with the political and social implications of that. 1776, Jeane Kirkpatrick said, was a marvelous year, a very good year. It was the year Providence made, as Tocqueville pointed out. And it's commemorated on the seal of the United States. If you have a dollar bill, it's worth a look. There is a structure built over an inscription which Catholics one day long past used to be able to read, Novus Ordo Seclorum. A phrase that appeared there as the motto only in the last of 7 drafts. The new order of the ages. Now, why of the ages? Well, Lady Thatcher remarked on a recent visit here that a friend of hers went to a library in rural England. This is to the point that it's easy enough to build a republic. What's hard to do is make a republic that will last for the ages. A friend of hers went to a library in rural England and requested a copy of the Constitution of the French Republic. And the librarian looked up at him over her glasses and said, "My dear, we don't carry periodicals." It's not easy to make a republic that would last. But the Novus Ordo, a new order, they knew that the order was new. Now, if we were to give an examination to the Congress or journalists or anybody and with 2 questions on it, hand out blue books and say, all right, what is the American Ordo? What is the American order? And second question, what's new about it? What made it different from France or Britain or Morocco or Constantinople or any of the republics that the framers had visited and knew at that time? I don't think many of us would be able to pass. We've not been a very philosophical people, but we need to become such, or we will lose our inheritance. Now, above it, they drew a picture so we couldn't mistake it. It is a pyramid. It can come from only one place on Earth, one country on Earth, and behind it a desert. They were instructed, the committee that drew up the seal, to link the people of the United States to the ancient people of Israel, who, like the ancient people, moved out from Egypt and had to cross a desert, a wilderness, to build there, to find there, the city on the hill. And they constructed a model of this new order, unique in history. One biblical teaching I didn't mention, a number I didn't, but one I particularly skipped, is the notion that every man and woman sometimes sins. The only moral majority there is are sinners. There's no use building a republic for saints. There aren't enough of them to fill a republic. And the ones there are too difficult to live with. If you're going to make a republic that will last, you have to build it for sinners. And since every man and woman sometimes sins, it's best not to trust any of them with too much power. Therefore, the very first thing to do is if you build a new system, divide it into 3 systems. And that's what you see in the pyramid, I think. Across the bottom, inscribed 1776. That year never to be forgotten. That year of extraordinary importance for the whole human race. It led to the Constitutional Convention, in which the great task was to constitute a government. Why do humans constitute governments? To secure their rights, governments are formed among men. It was one thing to declare your rights in 1776 and then to live in some disorder after vindicating those rights by victory, to become the laughingstock of Europe because we were so badly governed. And so they met an emergency session in 1787 to constitute a government. You can't have a free republic without a government. But it's going to be a limited government. It will have only those powers that people delegate to it, and it will be in a very short document. The Constitution of Brazil, I'm told, is 256 pages long. It won't work before they even put it to a test, just let me tell you. 256 pages is too much for lawyers. If you're going to be delegating powers, keep it short. It's a limited government, and it's not on top. That's why I think it's a good idea to imagine the government is down in the lower left-hand corner. And over on the other side, the framers, 1776 was the year of the wealth of nations, the first public use of the expression political economy. Canonized public use, not the very first. And the framers thought of themselves as building a commercial republic, for the first time entrusting a republic not to the aristocracy, or not to the army, or not to the clergy, but to people of commerce, vulgar lucre. And thought for very sound reasons that that was the only way. A free economy was the only way to stabilize, make possible, make workable a free republic. And then at the top of the pyramid, they deliberately left the building incomplete, as you can see. It's incomplete on the grounds that any republic committed to liberty and justice for all will never be finished. In fact, the trouble is it's hard to prevent backsliding. They had to worry that what was achieved by the first generation would be surrendered by the second and the third. Liberty is always the most fragile form of government because it takes only one generation to forget, or only one generation willingly to give it all away, and it's gone. The price of liberty is everlasting vigilance, they said again and again. And in the place of the completed pyramid, they put the eye. You can imagine it as the eye of honor and candor, of conscience. John Adams said the Hebrews did more for civilization than any other people because they rooted amongst us all the idea that no matter how rich nor how powerful a people should become, it is always under judgment. It is not almighty, it is not eternal, it is under judgment. And thus civilization became possible. Because from then on, everything must be judged in the light of truth and in the light of justice, not in the light of power. It doesn't matter if you have an opinion and have all the power in the world behind it. If it's not true, if it's not just, it's as nothing. And there's a right to resist it. That's a crucial notion for civilization and certainly for the free society. And therefore, I think it's quite right to see that eye as the eye of God, and above it they inscribed Annuit Keptis. He smiled on our beginnings. Providence smiled on our beginnings. I think it's quite legitimate to see that eye as the eye of God. But if not religious, one can see it as the eye of conscience or candor. Now, please note that our Constitution also enunciated a crucial principle that government simply is not competent in the moral and cultural order, in the order of conscience and information and ideas. It's above government. What Irving Kristol said today, that economics is not the fundamental question. Culture, morals, religion is the fundamental base of culture, is absolutely right. And it's shown in this seal, I believe. Conservatives are united in wanting to protect these three spheres, to keep them separate, to make sure that the same people who are the leaders in the field of morals and religion and information and ideas are not the main leaders in the political sphere or in the economic sphere, and the reverse. In fact, it's even attended that these people not like each other very much. Typically, in my experience, I've noticed that the intellectuals and the clergy have some disdain for businessmen, and they just don't understand politicians at all. A disdain is perhaps too weak a word. And I've met with politicians whose work I deeply admire, crucial for the human race, and they take crucial for the republic, and they take a lot of abuse for it. They typically don't think much of intellectuals and clergymen, and though they need businessmen, when they kick off their shoes at night and they're all alone, one tends to think they don't have very high regard for them either. The system is designed to be that way. That's why Frown has put on the seal also, "In God we trust," whose operational meaning is nobody else. Not businessmen, not government, not clergy, not the press, etc. But the system, conservatives are the one who want to keep those separations and keep them in their proper order and recognize that each of them is rooted finally in the notion that all of us, every woman, every man, is made in the image of God to be a creator, to be an inventor or a discoverer, to build up a new world. And each of us has a precious dignity, an immortal dignity. We're not just a bunch of chemicals. In that truth is grounded our rights. That's why they are inalienable. They don't come from the state or from anybody else. Now again, one doesn't have to be religious in order to see the power of these notions and how the soil of liberty grew out of these. Now, there's an awful lot to defend in those ideas, but it's only in proportion as we lose these ideas in the media and in the educational system and elsewhere that the whole idea of the republic begins to fall apart. And I think that's what scares people. I think the sense of it all unwinding and falling apart, that frightens people. And if they're not frightened, they don't see what's happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Novak. Our final speaker, Newt Gingrich, was an Army brat. His father was a career soldier, and Newt was carted all over the world as a child and wound up receiving his doctorate in modern European history from Tulane University. He then turned to teaching and taught history and environmental studies in Georgia for 8 years, until it occurred to him to become a congressman. And he has now been a congressman. He is in his 7th term as congressman from the 6th District of Georgia, and has made his mark, to say the least. Not so many years ago, but a number of years ago, when he was a new congressman, he sent me a typescript of his then new book, The Conservative Opportunity Society, for comment. And I wrote back and I said, Newt, you do not belong in the House of Representatives at all. You are a political strategist at heart. You ought to be at the Republican National Committee with a great big map of the United States behind you and colored pins in it. There was where I thought he belonged. But he persevered and proved me wrong. He definitely belongs in the House of Representatives, and Robert Novak, the noted columnist and TV commentator, said not long ago of him, more than any other politician, he has the courage to challenge the political system in Washington. In March 1989, he was elected to the 2nd highest Republican leadership post in the House, the position of House Republican Whip. And I don't think it's much of a secret that he is expected at the beginning of next year to succeed Bob Michel as Republican leader of the House of Representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Newt Gingrich.
It is a little bit intimidating to follow and be the last panelist on this particular panel. I have learned from Mr. Rockwell that as a defender of the Constitution and a Federalist, I was probably on the tyrannical side of that particular fight. I've learned from Carlin Bowman that as a leader of a party which could potentially put together a coalition against the 16% of the country that is liberal, I stand before you as a case study in ineffectiveness. And I was just reminded by my good friend Michael Novak that intellectuals despise politicians, clergymen despise intellectuals, businessmen pay for everybody and are despised by all. And late at night, when we politicians sit around and kick our shoes off, we get even by despising all of them. So I stand here with a certain hesitancy. And yet, I'm emboldened, I think, by the conversation to try to take this conference at face value, which is to say that you came together to talk about real ideas and not just to talk about intellectuality for the purpose of proving to each other you read books and can talk about intellectuality. So I'm going to throw at you a couple of real ideas, ideas that are maybe a little radical. As Ronald Reagan said in October of 1964, I'm going to speak of controversial things. And I'm going to start where Michael Novak left off, because I thought it was a wonderful evocation of where we are and how important it is. This is a unique civilization. There has been nothing like us before, and if we collapse, there may be a long time and a dark period of bloodshed and tyranny before there is anything like us again. And because for 2 generations we have lacked the moral courage to say that and to emphasize it, we have come very close to breaking ourselves. Now let me be blunt. You are sitting in the capital city of the most complex and sophisticated free society in history, and within a half-mile of you, children are cheated, raped, brutalized, and destroyed by the welfare state. You're meeting in a city in which government has failed abysmally, and the Republican Party has been so incompetent it has failed to offer a candidate for mayor who could speak to the hearts of those who are wounded, deprived, betrayed, and destroyed by the liberal Democrats. You are meeting in a city which has an accident and 2 machines. The accident is the President of the United States. He is there because the Reagan coalition split, and because by pure personal courage and toughness and perseverance, he achieved his dream in a highly improbable way that would probably not have fit any novel. And yet, he is an accident. And I think in many ways our strategy should accept that and move beyond him and figure out what we do and what America does, and not worry too much about stopping Clinton, because I suspect in the end he will stop himself. But I think we have to face the challenge of the 2 great machines, the Democratic Party, which runs the Senate, and which has run the Senate except for very brief periods for most of the last 60 years, and the Democratic Party, which runs the House and is the longest-lasting political machine in the world, other than Kim Il-sung in North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party. And you have to confront that fact, that for 40 consecutive years the Democrats have been in charge of the United States House of Representatives. It has been 42 years since a Republican speaker was sworn in, and if you are younger than 62 years of age, you have never voted in an election in which a Republican speaker was elected. In the 1950s, my dear friend Bill Rusher and Bill Buckley and the gang had a wild idea, and the idea was that ideas have consequences. And they began through magazines and through speeches and through debates to reshape American politics. And in many ways, they have succeeded beyond, I suspect, their hopes of the mid-1950s. And yet, in the process, the conservative movement, I want to suggest, made a mistake of extraordinary consequences. It took politics for granted. It did precisely what Michael Novak suggested intellectuals do. Politics is an art form. It is a process of bringing humans together. It's a process of finding just enough common ground to act. And in this particular country, our founding fathers, fearing tyranny, consciously designed a machine so inefficient that no dictator could force it to work. The corollary, of course, is they designed a machine so inefficient that even when we're volunteers, we can barely get it to work. And they would say, that's fine. That's the price of freedom, is to be frustrated. One of the weaknesses of the system is that there's an inertia, that once you have control of the machine, you can keep that control for a long time, and it takes an extraordinary public rebellion to change it. And because of the Cold War and the threat of the Soviet Empire, we overvalued the presidency, and for most of the intellectual renaissance of the conservative movement, we focused on the presidency. And we had in our greatest articulator the man who had studied under and believed in the greatest politician of the 20th century in this country, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And while you may disagree deeply with Roosevelt's policies, if you intend to be in charge of the country, and if you intend to have a movement that works, it is useful to study how he did it. And if you're not prepared to study how he did it, then you can't save the children who will be destroyed tonight. You can't save the families that will be ruined. You can't change the schools that are literally creating a generation of ignorance, and you can't get the job done. So I'm going to speak for just a couple of minutes about something I know fairly well, which is the art of the possible, the process of politics. You know, Carlin's numbers should stun all of you. 16% of the country is liberal. Now, you should be able to put together an 84% coalition and at least get 51% for our side. And yet, I would suggest to you that there are 3 sentences that describe the last quarter century of American public policy. First, beginning with Lyndon Johnson and George McGovern, the Democrats went too far to the left and they never came back. Second, the Republican Party rejected every effort of the American people to make it a majority. And third, the business and professional classes that create wealth and create modern civilization continue to be browbeaten and intimidated by the lawyers, the academics, the news media, and the unions. Now, if you can unlock the first sentence and find a way to return the Democratic Party to some core set of values and policies that make sense, you don't have to worry about the second and third sentences. I don't think you can, and I'm not here to explain how to do it. I'll let some Democrat try that. But if you cannot unlock the Democratic Party, and it is going to remain a party of centralized bureaucracy, a failed welfare state, redistributionist economics, and radical values, weak both towards criminals at home and foreign powers abroad, and at least at the moment seeming to lack some ethical framework within which to do anything. If that party is locked into that pattern, then you have to say to yourself, what is the other major vehicle for changing America? And it's the Republican Party. And for the Republican Party to succeed, you have to find a way to arouse the business and professional communities to take seriously their country's future. If you can't solve those 2 sentences, then I think we are in desperate trouble. And let me explain why I think it's desperate. And I agree with the tone, I think, that Michael was driving towards. We have had, and by the way, Bill Clinton, who reads the same focus groups we do and is remarkably skillful at saying the words even if they have no meaning when he says them, but communicates the right words at the right moment. In his State of the Union, I think by accident picked the right date and said, for 30 years families have been decaying. That's his quote in his State of the Union this year, which takes him back correctly to the Great Society, the last great experiment in replacing families with bureaucracies, replacing traditional values with radical values, and replacing the community with the state. And it's failed. The reason it's a threat to all of us, I think, goes to the core of civilization. I do not think it is possible to maintain civilization with 12-year-olds having babies, 15-year-olds killing each other, 17-year-olds dying of AIDS, and 18-year-olds getting diplomas they can't read. Now, I don't think this is a matter of Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. I think that you could go back to that Gallup poll database and you could pose that question to people, and you'd have an astonishing percentage that agreed with you. And yet, every one of those 4 things is happening in your national capital today during this conference. And so you have to say, what do we do about it? And I think it's a vital time to have this conference because it's a grave question in my mind whether the fall of the Berlin Wall was the launching point of the next great wave of freedom or the high water mark of freedom. Whether, in fact, we are now decaying at such a rate internally and the power of the left and the power of the welfare state are so great that we can't turn it around. And people will look back 2 centuries from now and say, that was the high water mark for that cycle of human freedom. Let me start by saying I think the title of the panel was wrong. I don't think you get anywhere in America talking about the radical state. First place, radical is not a word normal people use. And they don't understand exactly what it refers to, and you don't have the energy and resources to educate them. We just did a study. We were out at Annapolis looking at health care. As of this week, 50% of the American people, if given the option, will tell you they do not know enough about the Clinton plan to have a judgment. Now, if the President of the United States and his wife and all their effort have not penetrated deeply enough for half the country to have a judgment, it is highly unlikely that we will convince them of the word radical in a way which has any direct meaning to their lives. But there's a different word that does work, and that's failed welfare state. My guess is if you went around the country and said exactly what I said a minute ago, 12-year-olds having babies, 15-year-olds killing each other, 17-year-olds dying of AIDS, 18-year-olds getting diplomas that they can't read. Virtually every American will tell you that that's happening. And if you then said to them, do you think the welfare state has failed? They'd say yes. If you went a step further and said, do you think government is too big and spends too much? The answers are overwhelming. That was the most widely accepted single sentence of the 1992 campaign. It was uttered by George Bush. And people overwhelmingly agreed with it. And had that been the centerpiece of the Republican campaign in '92, my guess is we would have won decisively. Now, how do we then turn that into a future that works? Let me say, first of all, that I believe you have to think of this problem at several levels. There's not a single answer. If you don't look at it from a standpoint, and I use a very simple planning model of 4 words, but I use it to try to make sense out of a very complex historical setting. You first have to have a vision. Let me suggest to you, our vision shouldn't be negative. Our vision should be positive. There is no history in America of a negative movement ever succeeding. Positive movements succeed. And I would argue that anti-communism was, in fact, protecting America. People felt very positive and very patriotic about defending freedom. I would argue if you watch Reagan, Reagan was consistently an optimist. And that's part of what gave him such enormous power, that he made people feel that the future was possible and they could be part of it. So at the vision level, I think we ought to be very positive in our commitment to renewing American civilization. And we ought to encourage everybody who believes there is an American civilization to join us. That will automatically cause a civil war in the Democratic Party between those who are convinced there isn't an American civilization and those who are. But deeper beyond partisanship, it begins to be the positive framework within which to talk about ourselves. Because if you're going to broadly be conservative, you have to have a sense of history. Otherwise, what is it you're conserving? And I think the American history and the American tradition is well worth not only studying, but defending and teaching. In that framework, I think our strategies have to include leading a coalition. Well, let me repeat something I've said to every Christian coalition meeting I've gone to. Because we're told, how can you have a big tent, and how can you bring people together? And can you really have libertarians and populists and conservatives in the same room? And if you listen to Carlin, you know, if you have all 3 in the same room, you are an overwhelming, stable, defining majority. And as soon as you kick any one of the 3 elements out, you're in a desperate fight to be whether or not you can be a majority. So if you want to govern, if you want to do positive things, you have to run a coalition. Now, I cite the following example to every Christian coalition group, and I want to share it with you. If a reporter had gone to Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 and said, we understand you're getting the votes of Mississippi segregationists and Chicago blacks, isn't that clearly cheating? Roosevelt would have laughed him out of the room. He would have said, first of all, I am better for both groups than Herbert Hoover. Second, it is my job in a free society to bring together enough people and then to figure out how to give to each group that which they have to have in order to have permission to give to the next group that which they have to have. Now, let me be up front. If you are an intellectual with a passion for Cartesian logic, this will not work. And I don't expect you to approve it. I don't expect you to write books endorsing it. I don't expect you to think it's noble. But it is the way for 200 years that a free people have governed themselves. It is the way that Jefferson went north and met Aaron Burr and founded the Democratic Party. It is the way that Lincoln helped put together the coalition which governed and saved the Union. It is the way in which Theodore Roosevelt ran the Republican Party at its peak. It is the way, candidly, that Ronald Reagan won in 1980. So if you're at all interested in actually helping save the country and actually helping renew American civilization, and you think that the practical business of having political power and running the government is useful, then it is at least worth being aware of. And so you have to have a coalition. And any strategy which doesn't start by saying, how are we going to put together our coalition, is an irrelevancy, because you can't gain control of all the instruments that are necessary if you're determined to be a tiny minority. I am not saying that means you sell out. I'm not even saying that means you compromise. I'm saying it means you have to be clever in picking the fights that unify your side and split theirs, not rush out and try to pick the fights that split your side and unify theirs. Now, let me say, I think we have to recruit. We also have to recognize that Washington, while it is vitally important for the negative reason that the federal government's a great threat, is not where America will be safe. The trick is to unlock Washington, to diminish the federal government, to return power to the states and localities, to return resources to private citizens, to return resources to private businesses, so that individuals and families and communities can in fact save themselves and can have the flourishing opportunity to be creative. And I believe that you have to have not a masterful presidential candidate or 50 good senators. I believe you have to have at least 200,000 partners for progress all across the country, prepared to work at school board and at county commission and at city council, and to work together at this hard work of freedom in order to be able to change things. And along the line Michael talked about in terms of reacquiring the basic principles of American civilization, let me say in passing that I did take the risk of actually teaching a course while serving in elected office. It's called Renewing American Civilization. It's a commentary on modern America that I taught it last fall at a state college, Kennesaw State College, and the University of Georgia Board of Regents promptly adopted the rule that you could not teach a course if you're an elected official on the grounds that if you had policies that people did not like enough to defeat you, you were safe, but if you had policies that people liked enough to elect you, you were automatically dangerous. And so we're teaching it now at Reinhardt College, which is a Methodist college that allows freedom of speech even for elected officials. And Renewing American Civilization is a 20-hour effort to expand on what I'm trying to say to you in a very short time before Bill Rusher gives me the hook. And for any of you who want to see more of it, it's available on National Empowerment Television every Wednesday from 1 to 3. We're going to show it 5 times this year. It's 10 2-hour segments, so it's 20 hours of material. It's also available in audio and videotape. And we have an 800 number. It's 1-800-2-RENEW. That's T-O, Renew, R-E-N-E-W. And I mention that in part because like Ross Perot, I think it works. And also because we've had over 1,000 phone calls in January to the 800 number from people trying to find out how to take the course. My favorite group being the Rancho Cucamonga Fire Department, who did take 2 weeks off to go do the Malibu fires, but then came back and finished the course. And our goal is to outline what are the principles by which we can, in fact, renew our civilization and reestablish the unique, wonderful sense of freedom. And I'll give you just 2 tests that you can apply to everybody. I'll give the 800 number again in a second because I saw some of you getting your pens out late. The first test is simple. If Hitler had won, if Tojo's Japan had won, if Stalin's Russia had won, if Mao's China had won, if the only superpower on the planet was one of those 4, does anyone seriously believe that freedom could have spread? And the answer, of course, is no. They were tyrannies. We believed in freedom, not just for Americans, but we believe that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And, of course, that was an 18th century phrase for all men and all women. All humans are endowed by their Creator, which is a very radical thought in some of the more Islamic fundamentalist societies. Secondly, think of the last 2 chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A first-generation descendant of West Indian blacks who went to the City College of New York in ROTC, Colin Powell, followed by a first-generation immigrant in his own right from Eastern Europe who went to Bradley University in ROTC, John Shalikashvili. Now, a civilization which can absorb that level of talent, promote it through merit, turn over to it control of our military forces, and never for a second worry about a coup d'etat. That is a remarkable civilization, and it is well worth studying and extending and renewing. And I would say, And I would say that if we were to simply build a positive coalition around that, and then agree we're going to fight about details, but we know we're going to replace the welfare state. We know there are positive things we can do. The 800 number, by the way, for those of you who did get your pen out, is 1-800-2-RENEW, T-O-R-E-N-E-W. You have to be shamelessly persistent in this business. But that's part of the trade, frankly, if you want to really, truly change a country of this size and this complexity. Let me just tell you very briefly in closing what we're going to try to do in the House Republican Party in the near future. First of all, on April 15th, we're going to have coast-to-coast Boston Tea Parties where we're going to remind everyone that taxes don't have to be this high, government doesn't have to be this wasteful, and you ought to have first right to your own money. And we're going to encourage everybody everywhere in the country to spend part of April 15th remembering there is a cost to big government and there is a cost to the welfare state. There's a human cost and a fiscal cost. And any of you who'd like to be part of that Boston Tea Party, we're hoping that Grover Norquist is going to be involved, Lisa Nelson at GOPEC is going to be involved, and Sharon Cooper, a constituent of mine who just wrote a new book called Taxpayers' Tea Party, which is a book about how you can do an independent expenditure to beat somebody who raised your taxes. The theory being that if you spent the amount they raised your taxes to beat one of them, you'd wipe out enough of them this fall that you'd change everything. Second, Bill McCollum, congressman from Florida, is putting together a petition drive nationwide for everybody who wants a serious anti-crime bill. The difference, and I noticed that I think it was Carlin who made the comment that Bill Clinton and I sound a lot alike on crime. The difference is I mean it. Watch. And I just want to say very briefly, you live in a country which has a crime problem because government is failing to do its job. This is not a complicated problem. 14% of convicted rapists serve 0 days in jail. 14%. Over 7,500 rapists a year serve 0 days in jail when they're convicted. 28% of felony assaults spend 0 days in jail. There are 5 million violent crimes a year. There are 100,000 violent people sentenced a year. Of those who are sentenced, a large number are released early. 979 felons are released early every day. The result is 65 Americans are killed and 240 are raped every day. Now, the answer is pretty straightforward, and Pete DuPont describes it elegantly in a manifesto in the next issue of National Review. The answer is you build enough prisons. It's not even hard. We have surplus military bases. We don't have to go through long, complex acquisition of land. We have some bases in very rural areas with very few people who would complain, most of whom would like to have jobs as guards and serving the infrastructure. You could build them very inexpensively using National Guard engineer battalions. You could do a lot of things if you applied practical common sense to this principle. We as a nation owe it to our people to protect them from foreign enemies and domestic enemies. We owe it to our people to protect them from predators. And every day somebody is killed, every day some child is raped, every day somebody is brutalized because we can't get our act together to lock up violent criminals. Shame on us. Lastly, for my part and for our part in the House Republican Party, we will have a checklist of items we are going to pass on the very first day. We'll have ads and TV guide that will allow you this fall to look at that checklist. When we end 40 years of one-party control, we will, in fact, on the opening day, as our very first act after electing a speaker, we will pass the Shays Act, which will apply to the Congress, every law which applies to the rest of the country. We will, second, announce which of the big 6 auditing firms we have hired in order to audit the House's books on the premise that if Rostenkowski gave back $82,000, who knows how much we might collect by the time we get done with the audit. We will, third, cut the congressional committee staffs by 1/3, both to save you money directly and to send the signal to the Clinton administration that if we're prepared to cut our staffs, they can't imagine what we'll do with theirs. And then we'll do other things that day on the very opening day. In addition, at the end of that day, we'll introduce 10 bills, which will be our contract with the American people, which will be introduced into Congress this fall, so you can see the bill, not just hear the promise. Those include bills on anti-violent crime, on welfare reform to require work and to minimize teenage pregnancies out of wedlock, to stop illegal aliens from coming in and getting money from the welfare state, to strengthen our national defense. There will be a series of those bills with the promise that we will bring them all to the floor in the first 90 days and have recorded votes in every one of them so you can see who's prepared to actually pass legislation and change things. My closing comment is this, and it's about the hard, difficult business of winning elections in a free society. This is hard work. I had to run 3 times. I lost twice. It took 5 years. And I will tell you, in terms of serving my country and in trying to change things, it was worth every day and every handshake and every request for contributions, because in the end, you have to be willing to win elections if in a free society you're going to change things. And I just want to close with this thought before you walk off and say, gee, it'd be nice, but it's impossible. Communism collapsed in Russia and in Czechoslovakia. and in Hungary and in Poland. In Italy, they have wiped out the current political system because it was so corrupt it resembled some of the things you're seeing in your own government. In France, the socialists were wiped out last spring. In Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party lost control for the first time since elections after World War II. And in Canada, the governing party, which had raised taxes, went into the election with 153 seats and ended the election with 2. Can you imagine being prime minister and watching your party election day cease to exist as a legal party? Now, I don't think we'll get down to just Foley and Gephardt. I wouldn't object, but I don't think we will. But my message to you is, this is real. There are humans who suffer every day that we fail to do our job, and in addition to being intellectually right, we have to be competent enough that we give the American people a chance to renew their civilization and to replace the welfare state. Thank you very much.
Is this yours, Bill? Is this your pen?
No. Well, thank you, Congressman. Because we started a little late, the powers that be have given us permission to continue until 5:45, which by my watch is 14 minutes away. So we have some time for questions and comments. Are there mics up around the room? Yes. All right, let's start over there. And I would appreciate if you'd keep the questions short, indicate who they're for.
This is for Newt Gingrich. My name is Kevin Vigilante. I'm doing my bit to save American civilization by running against Patrick Kennedy in Rhode Island for a congressional seat. And of course, 2 of the big issues on everybody's minds today when you speak to groups are crime and education. But as we know, these are largely state issues. And in your experience, when you communicate these ideas to people and you talk about representing them on the federal level, what's the most effective way to communicate or to actually federalize these issues, which are largely state?
Well, first of all, because of the nature of the current welfare state, there are sadly no issues that are purely state issues. So let me suggest to you on crime that we ought to restrict the federal judges who are developing grotesque country club standards for prisons, because federal judges are causing a large part of the problem. On crime, it is ironic that the biggest single program Clinton is trying to kill in his list of the 100 programs is the Byrne Memorial Fund, which is the largest single local government grant of money, specifically anti-drug and anti-violent crime money from the federal government. It is the federal government which has the habeas corpus rules that make it so difficult to have an effective, believable death penalty. So you've got to, there's things you can do very directly, and Bill, when you'll get a list from us from Bill McCollum of a very series of specific things we're prepared to do to help states. I also have introduced a proposal to allow states and local governments to roll back 50% of the unfunded mandates in order to spend that money on crime, on prisons, prosecutors, and police. So you can say, as a member of Congress, you'll let Rhode Island and you'll let the local city and county governments make the decisions about whether it's more important to protect you from being raped or killed, or it's more important, as Mayor Reardon says in LA, to have water in the Los Angeles River cleaner than the water you drink in Los Angeles, which is the current standard they're being held to. Secondly, I would just say to you, in your case, running in an area where you're running, go and see Brett Schundler in Jersey City. He is the most interesting, most effective Republican in the country today, and spend a day with him and learn how he does it, because he got 68% of the vote in an area where he shouldn't have been able to win, which had not had a Republican mayor since 1904, and spend some time with Brett Schundler.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, right over here.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you about one issue that's a part of the conservative coalition.
Short.
And ask your comment on it. That's the right to work, the freedom to work without being forced to pay union dues as a condition of employment. Now, there is a proposal being advanced by a former Bush administration cabinet member, former New York congressman, who's being talked about for President of the United States in '96 as a Republican candidate, who has repeatedly urged the Republican Party to stop advocating right to work and to form an accommodation and ultimately an alliance with organized labor, the AFL-CIO. And I would like to ask each of you to tell me whether you think that's a good or a bad idea. Thank you.
You have, of course, quadrupled the length of time it will take to answer your question, you realize. We will ask the panel to keep it reasonably short then. Go ahead, Lou.
I disagree with Jack Kemp on that. Jack, of course, was very close to the labor unions all the time he was in Congress and still promotes their interests, and it's very unfortunate. And we should keep right-to-work laws, and we should have them in the states that don't now have them.
I agree that we should have them, but I'm not familiar with Kemp's position.
Michael Novak.
An awful lot of Reagan Democrats were union workers.
I think, first of all, it's a mischaracterization of Kemp's position. He took on the unions, for example, a great deal over issues like tenant management, tenant ownership, and had almost every public housing union in the country mad at him for what he was doing. I think clearly we are the movement of freedom. We believe in the right to work, but I would focus my fire on the Clinton administration's extraordinary effort to extend the agency shop to require every federal employee to give money to the unions whether they belong or not, which to me is a real outrage and something that every American should focus their fire on.
Lady over there.
This is very short. Newt, I'm interested in your tea parties, and do we get information on where they're going to be held and when, whatever, at
Sure.
that 2 renew number, or is
No,
there
no,
another
no.
number?
Those are totally separate.
Okay.
I don't want to get in trouble with the IRS, particularly under this administration.
You just let everybody know how we can get involved.
Let me just say, if you'll call Lisa Nelson at GOPAC, or if you'll call Grover Norquist, who I saw there a while, is Grover still here? He's one of the leading anti-tax activists in the country, and I think he'll be around later on this afternoon. And I think if you'll talk to Grover or Lisa, they'll give you the information. GOPAC, G-O-P-A-C. It's 202-484-2282.
Congressman Gingrich, I want to congratulate you. You give a very good speech on bureaucracy, the evils of bureaucracy. You have very good rhetoric, but I'd like to ask you why. The Washington Post reports that you single-handedly saved the Clinton presidency by delivering him a victory on NAFTA, which creates at least 50 new trade, environmental, and labor bureaucracies above our own federal bloated bureaucracy with the authority to tyrannize people across the entire North American continent. Isn't it a little bit hypocritical to denounce bureaucracy in a speech like this when the Washington Post credits you for delivering him this great victory?
Well, you're mixing 3 different issues. Okay, first of all, I believe, as Ronald Reagan did, in the idea of a larger free market. It was Reagan in October '79 who proposed it. It was Bush who negotiated it. And I thought that those of us who believe in a larger market for trade and who believe that in the long run America's role is to lead the world by competing, not to run and hide, had an obligation to stand up and be counted. So I don't have any problem defending the NAFTA vote. Second, I would just point out to all of you that whether or not the Clinton administration survives or passes has dramatically less to do with one particular vote by Newt Gingrich and one particular effort by House Republicans, and vastly more to do with a decade in Arkansas. And so I'm not particularly worried about whether or not we saved the Clinton administration. I thought we did what was right for America, and I think that's our job. Our job is not to campaign 4 years and try to destroy a president. This is not a parliamentary system. And I despise the Democrats who undermined George Bush. I thought it was terrible when every Democratic elected official leader in the House and Senate voted against Desert Storm. I thought it was just incredibly destructive of America to have them be partisan. And you can't turn right around and say to me, why don't you pretend you're George Mitchell and be as destructive to the Democratic president as George Mitchell was to the Republican. I don't think we can live that way.
My question's for Congressman Gingrich, and earlier we've been talking about, he talked about the legislative agenda he'd like to press. I'd like to know, frankly, what you think your chances are of becoming the next speaker or the speaker in '97.
I think that depends almost entirely on how many Americans decide they're fed up and are prepared to go fight. I mean, if enough Americans show up and decide, for example, if 5,000 Americans, 5,000 out of the whole country, took the amount of money they will pay in tax increases and went out under an independent expenditure, which you're allowed to spend as much as you want to because it's free speech, and picked off one person each, which would mean you could actually pile on and have something like 20 people hitting each Democrat who voted yes last year for a tax increase. Just got even, which is why it's called Taxpayers' Tea Party. I mean, why isn't it time for us to have some fun instead of just the politicians? I suspect you would drown the system in advertising and in effort and you would break the back of the democratic machine. Now, my job is to reach out to you and say, this is your country. These are your children who are dying and who are being miseducated and who are being ruined. And when are you going to get mad enough that you take back your country? I'll do everything I can to do my part, but I'm only one American. And I think this room has enough personal friends that if this room took it seriously, I would in fact be leading the Republican Party in a majority in January, and we would in fact be changing the history of the United States, and through that, I think, the history of the world.
I think it's perfectly natural that most of the questions are going to Congressman Gingrich since he has the public position. But since our time is short, I think it's only fair, too, that I hereafter will ask the other panelists if they wish to comment on the answers that he gives if further questions are addressed to him. And everybody, including the questioners, keep it short. Yes, sir.
This question is mainly addressed to the people not now serving in government on the panel, and that is that during World War II, Chiang Kai-shek was asked why he was saving up all this ammunition for Mao rather than the Japanese, and he said the Japanese are a disease of the skin and the communists are a disease of the heart. It seems to me that many of the international wars between the conservatives take that attitude. Is it possible to fight all we want in the journals and in organizations like this, but when it actually comes to running elections, to just combine there and fight all we want in this sort of atmosphere? Mr. Rockwell.
Gosh, I think yes. I mean, I think I think it's important to intellectually differentiate. I think it's important not to paper over real differences. But when it comes to, the Republican candidate against the Democrat, of course, even if it's, I mean, none of us are ever going to have somebody that we can support 100%. So it seems to me it's obviously true.
Ditto.
All right, Dr. Novak.
A free society is a complicated part. It's got a free political system, a free economy, a free and profound moral and cultural system. Before there was Novus Ordo Seclorum in the motto, for the first 6 drafts, the word was virtue. To have self-government, you have to have people of certain capacities of self-government in their private lives, people with a certain level of virtue, what Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia for. So there are battles to be fought in the cultural area, there are battles to be fought in the economic area, there are battles to be fought in the political area. We have lots of work for many different kinds of conservatives. There's no need to fight among ourselves to meet all those tasks.
Over there.
I'd like to comment on the Congressman's insight that we can't win if we separate ourselves. And in fact, that makes the other side more unified if we scare them. And I just had the bad experience in a session here where we were told to ostracize gay people. And then after, I shouldn't have to say this either, but I'm a practicing homosexual, or heterosexual. And if the sex police, want to check that, they can come into my room tonight. I shouldn't have to say that. I didn't come here to see individual freedom and liberty and small government be contradicted like that. And in the hall later, as a way of explanation in the hall later, their sexuality should be outlawed. I am no psychiatrist, I'm no biologist, but I think Time and Newsweek are even at the point now where they're saying that those people have about as much chance of changing their sexuality and their behavior as black people do, becoming white. Now, I just want to know if we think that every gay person in this room right now and every speaker tonight and tomorrow should leave and join Bill Clinton.
Well, let me answer you about as directly as I can. I was asked recently, do I have a policy where I would not discriminate based on somebody being gay? And my answer was, I have a policy in my office of not asking what you're doing. I'd be as offended if one of my staff was flagrantly heterosexual on the Capitol grounds on Tuesday afternoon as if they were flagrantly homosexual. I think that goes back in part to what Michael's saying. There are some things that will be private. But if you watch the homosexual activist movement's demands, they are not for the right to privacy in the bedroom. They are for first graders being taught that you should really understand why people may be homosexual. And I have to tell you, I think a healthy, rational society has a bias in favor of heterosexuality. I think it has a bias in favor of the family. That doesn't mean you need to have police in the men's room in Central Park. It doesn't mean that you have to go out and try to find people to prosecute, but it does mean, as a general principle, that you are a healthier society if, for example, we change the current tax law, which punishes people for being married because they have a lower deduction, and punishes people under Social Security for staying married. Now, I'm prepared to be in favor of a pro-marriage, and I define marriage as deliberately heterosexual, because the purpose in every society I know of sponsoring and strengthening marriages related to children and orderly structures for the raising of children. And so I'm willing to be beaten up routinely by various homosexual activist groups who say that if I am pro-family, I am in some way against them. I don't, frankly, particularly want to know what people do in their private, not the Bobbitts, not anybody. I don't want to know what happens. I don't watch the court channel. I don't have any passion about people's private behaviors. But I do think as a society, we do have a legitimate right to suggest that there are some values and some behaviors of greater long-run importance to freedom, and that we are going to support and favor those.
Any other
and one more
member of
question.
the panel? Wait a minute, sir. You had your question. Now I'm going to ask other members of the panel to comment.
What if we
you
find
just
out
wait.
that those people are born
you
that
wait.
way? What do we
you
do
have
then?
had your turn,
Okay,
and
thanks.
you can quiet down. Anybody else on the panel want to talk about this matter? A comment at all? All right. It is now 5:46, and we are a minute over our
Can we take Grover?
promised time. Who?
That is Grover Norquist.
Grover Norquist. I didn't
Hi.
even see you there. Well,
Grover
we'll make an
Norquist.
exception. Go
With
ahead.
Thank you very much. With Americans for Tax Reform, and we're looking very much to work with Congressman Gingrich and GOPAC to get demonstrations all across the country on April 15th, so that we do discuss the cost of what the welfare state is doing in terms of money as well as lives that it's been destroying. I had one quick question for the panel, and that is, what is the role of choice in education as a way to broaden the conservative or Republican base, both with minorities and others, and how do you see that playing out?
Maybe a quick question, but I'm afraid it requires a long answer. And I'm going to respect the timetable that I gave earlier and call this meeting to a close. We want the reception this evening and the dinner to go forward. We're already 15 minutes late on our schedule. Let's call it that for the time being, but thanks for your point.
You're right, it would have been a long answer.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching C-SPAN's coverage of the National Review Institute's Conservative Summit. That summit is taking place this weekend here in Washington, D.C. We have this programming note. This coming week here on C-SPAN, we'll air live coverage of a Democratic National Committee National Party meeting in Cleveland, Ohio. Live coverage of that meeting will take place Friday, March 11th and Saturday, March 12th here on C-SPAN.